Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Hope you're doing well. Buddies, welcome to my room. Well, you know, I wasn't expecting to make a video, but in the end, that's what I'm doing. And I do not need to give you any other reason than this. Oh, what am I saying? Well, listen, there is this question that's always recurring, about what is the INFJ type closest to in terms of, other types? What other type is the INFJ type most like? And what's interesting about the INFJ type is that I think it's by its nature a type that is likely to have a large number of potential candidates. If you think about a type like an ISTJ, for example, ISTJs are most like ESTJs. Now, to some extent, you could also say that ISTJs are a little bit like ISFJs. They have a dominant function in common that cannot be overestimated. But even when you get to the ESFJ points, it's clear that ISTJs and ESFJs have very little in common and often do conflict because of FE dominance. So if you take a type like ISTJ, you'll notice that there's only really ISFJ and ESTJ that are kind of close to it. And that applies for the majority of the types. It applies also to, intuitive types, definitely. If you think about like an ENFP, for example, like what is a type that is close to an ENFP? INFP, and that's pretty much it, right? ENFPs are very different from ENTPs. They're very different from ENFJs. There's a superficial similarity, maybe if you talk to a person just for a couple of minutes, but ultimately an ENFP is only going to be similar to a dynamic INFP. So, if you wanted to take a last example, INTPs. Well, INTPs, I can think of two types that are a little bit similar to them. There's only ENTPs and ISTPs. If the INTP is a very strong dominant TI and has a slightly repressed, or at least not very showcased NE, and that can happen, they might come across a little bit as ISTPs, and vice versa for ISTPs who have well-developed NI in their third slot. And a slightly animated INTP, just like a slightly animated INFP, will sometimes wonder whether they might be ENFP or ENTP. Also taken into account that ENFPs and ENTPs are not very extroverted types among extroverts in general, on average. Now, you could really apply this to any type, and you'll notice that there's like one or two cousin types at most. And yes, the INFJ type seems to be a little bit of an outlier in this scenario because, God, you hear all sorts of things. You hear INFJs are most like ENFJs, quite common. You hear INFJs are a lot like INTJs, it's common. But you also hear INFJs are a lot like INFPs, INFJs are a lot like ENFPs, and even, I'm sure you heard that one before, INFJs are a lot like ENTPs. And wow, that's a lot of possible cousin types. And I think there's something to be said in the defense of all of these types, because at a very superficial level, if you don't know an INFJ well, they can't, especially if they're a little bit shy and not very self-assertive, they are likely to come across as INFPs. I think that of all the types that I just mentioned, INFPs are actually the types that INFJs have the least in common with. So if you take INFPs, ENFPs, ENFJs, INTJs. Did I mention INTPs? Maybe I forgot to mention INTPs as well. So INFPs and INTPs is probably the least cousiny to the INFJ. but still quite close in a lot of ways. So an INFJ who has a well-developed TI can easily come across as an INTP, also because of their FE and their end function. But I would say that, in fact, in person, it's more likely that an INFJ will come across either as an ENTP, an ENFJ, or an INTJ. With the INTJ, it's quite obvious. I mean, the reason is simply that they have NI-SE axis in common, dominant NI, inferior SE. If you are an INFJ that doesn't emote, very naturally, maybe you have a little bit of an awkward FE. For whatever reason, the same reason that an INTP's NE could be a bit repressed, an INFJ's FE could be a bit repressed as well, and you have the NITI INFJ types. They could come across as ENTPs quite a bit, or INTPs, but I think INFJs tend to come across more extroverted than INTPs because of their FE. Even if the FE is repressed and a bit dysfunctional, it's always still going to be there and going to make them come across as more extroverted. And this is why you find yourself in situations where, if you go to the database, the very good example, very interesting example of this, if you go to the database of personality types, personality-database.com, I think, if you check Jordan Peterson, you'll notice, I don't know what he is at the moment. He's usually INFJ or ENTP. The most common votes for Jordan Peterson are ENTP and INFJ. Ask yourself why. Well, because people interpret his function use according to either the ENTP template or the INFJ template. So that's an interesting piece of evidence, because there's also a lot of votes for Jordan Peterson, because he's such a visible intellectual figure. There can be a lot of confusion, and like the ENTP type is so well suited to come across as INFJ, or the reverse, if the INFJ has a slightly repressed FE and a well-developed TI. Because then really, if you accept the inferior function, the only difference is that one is NE and one is NI. That's true. That can be very different, but it doesn't have to come across as very different, especially if like an ENTP is a very organized kind of mode of thinking, or an INFJ is a little bit more, geared toward openness. And so, not to underestimate just how like ENTPs, INFJs can be when they are comfortable living with the expression of their TI. It usually comes with, confidence, socially confident INFJs and rational INFJ subtypes. But that being said, the INTJ type, at the end of the day, if I had to look at it purely from a functional perspective, I can only say that the INTJ type is the type that has the most in common with the INFJ type. This is based on the sharing of the dominant function, of course, but although there are obvious differences between the TFI axis and the FETI axis, the dominant function gives you your primary mode of access to the world. So there's going to be a lot in common with how the INFJ and how the INTJ see the world, and how they will approach solving problems. Now, the actual execution of the solving of the problem, or the execution of how to go about living in the world, interacting with people, making important life decisions, obviously that's going to be very different. INTJs will tend to be more practical, decisive, and very kind of motivated by personal feeling. Slightly in the background, INFJs will be eager to get approval from the tribe, and will tend to be rational, but in a way that analyzes situations sometimes endlessly, rather than just taking a quick decision like T would, in terms of what's most efficacious at any particular moment of time. But again, the approach to the world and this problem solving, in terms of how it's dealt with in the first place, it's insight, it's intuition, it's this inability to quite explain how one arrives at a particular moment of clarity. Like that happens that concept is a bit mystical in the literature. It ought to be demystified, not because it doesn't exist, but because it is actually a lot more common than people think. It's like part of the INFJ and the INTJs every day. And so I would place them as closest to one another, even though in person, superficially, they might not. An INFJ might come across initially more as an INFP or an INTP or an ENTP. But the more you spend time with the person, the more you'll notice the similarities with INTJ. Now, ENFJ, I don't think it's such a close cousin. Of course, functionally, it is the second closest after the INTJ. But it is simply unusual to meet an INFJ, even an FE subtype INFJ whose FE is so strong that it manifests as dominant FE. Because like I said in many videos before, the difference between FE dominant and FE auxiliary is not just that you're more proficient in one or the other, or that you have a preference for one over the other. It's not like the INFJ is just an ENFJ that happens to prefer NI to FE, and that the ENFJ is an INFJ who happens to prefer FE to NI. The dominant FE doesn't qualitatively manifest in the same way as auxiliary FE. Dominant FE imposes peace, imposes norms and systems of interaction so that harmony is ensured. FE auxiliary contributes to the preservation of the peace through influence over social interactions and through subtle, moments of input. But it doesn't impose. FE dominance imposes. And that's a fundamental difference in the manifestation of FE, which almost systematically ensures that an INFJ will never come across as an ENFJ. Even though, again, functionally, there's a lot in common. But most importantly, dominant function. What is the dominant function? That will determine, what type we are the closest to. So based on what I just said, I think it's pretty undeniable. And I think, established as far as I'm concerned, that INTJ and INFJ have the most in common. But again, ENTP, INTP, ENFP, INFP, there's greatest similarity. Keep in mind, INFP and ENFP have no functions in common with an INFJ, so the similarity, which can seem strong on the surface, is bound to turn out to be a bit shallower upon closer scrutiny. And on this note, I wish you an excellent rest of the weekend. See you guys.